We don't need your kind loitering around here where families are trying to enjoy themselves. Officer Todd Brecker said it before he had even finished stepping out of his patrol car, loud enough for the two mothers unloading equipment bags from a minivan near the far end of the parking lot to stop what they were doing and look over loud enough for a groundskeeper dragging a bucket of chalk across the outfield grass to straighten up and squint toward the sound loud enough that it landed in the still morning air of Lincoln Grove Baseball Complex, the way a stone lands in a shallow pond. Not dramatic, not explosive, just immediate and impossible to ignore. The Saturday morning had come in soft and gray, the kind of late autumn morning where the sun tries hard, but never quite convinces anyone it's warm, where the dew holds on the outfield grass until almost 9 o'clock, and the aluminum bleachers along third base conduct the cold directly through whatever you're wearing. The concession stand was still locked, its metal shutters down and padlocked. The scoreboard at the far end of the field displayed nothing but a faint rust stain where numbers used to rotate. The parking lot held only 4 vehicles, the minivan, a pickup truck belonging to the groundskeeper, a silver SUV parked at an angle near the entrance, and now Todd's patrol car nosed in at an angle that partially blocked the main exit, as if he'd arrived expecting something to run. The woman he was talking about, or rather the woman he was talking at, was seated on the aluminum bleachers along the third base line about 12 rows up from the field, with a clipboard resting across her knees and a red thermos sitting on the bench beside her, its label faded almost entirely from years of use. She was 47 years old, with dark brown skin and close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of still deliberate posture that isn't quite formal, but isn't casual, either the posture of someone who has learned over a long time how to occupy space in a way that gives nothing away. She wore a navy blue polo shirt with no logo, dark jeans, and running shoes that had seen too many miles to still look new. To anyone passing through, she looked like a parent who had arrived early to a game that hadn't started yet. To Todd Brecker, she apparently looked like something else entirely. Her name was Denise Carver. She had arrived at the complex at 6:10 in the morning, which was exactly when she meant to arrive because Denise had been doing this long enough to know that the preparation always took longer than the schedule suggested, and that if you didn't build in margin, the margin disappeared and took your credibility with it. This was not her first time running a clinic at a public recreational facility, and it would not be her last. In the 4 years since she had taken on her current role, she had walked the perimeters of 23 different fields, gymnasiums and community centers across Michigan, always the same way, clipboard in hand, eyes moving in methodical sweeps from one end of the space to the other, noting the sight lines and the exit locations and the places where afternoon sun would fall directly into the faces of kids trying to concentrate. She noted which sections of bleacher would stay shaded longest. She noted whether the parking lot had a clear line of sight to the field or whether a row of trees created a blind spot. She noted the distance from the main entrance to the nearest point of the playing surface because that distance mattered when you were coordinating the arrival of 34 children between the ages of 10 and 15 and their parents and their equipment. She had reviewed the layout of Lincoln Grove online before coming, had studied the satellite image on the county recreation website until she could sketch the rough shape of the property from memory. But you always walked it yourself before the day of, because photographs didn't show you where the low spots in the grass were or which gate latch stuck or how sound carried from the parking lot to the field when there wasn't a game going on and everything was quiet. These were the things that mattered, the small operational details that separated a clinic that ran smoothly from one that didn't. By 7:15, she had completed her circuit of the facility and settled back onto the bleachers with her clipboard. The top sheet held her lesson plan for Sunday morning, a 3-hour session she had titled Thinking Before the Moment, designed around real scenarios drawn from community policing programs she had studied across 6 different states. The second sheet was a roster, 34 names, ages, and emergency contact numbers. She had read through it twice on the drive over, committing faces to the names she recognized from previous events, making mental notes about the ones she hadn't met yet. She had been sitting there for roughly 40 minutes, making small revisions to the curriculum with a black pen when the silver SUV near the entrance caught her attention. A woman in her early 50s had stepped out, looked toward the bleachers, and stood very still for what Denise counted as approximately 22 seconds before getting back in the car. Denise watched her make a phone call. She noted the time, 8:14 a.m., and wrote a small asterisk in the margin of her clipboard, next to nothing in particular, which was a habit she had developed years ago when she worked cases where the early details turned out to matter most. On the bench beside the thermos, slightly tucked under the strap of her bag, where the morning cold had made the leather stiff, sat a small black case roughly the size of a thick wallet, with a raised seal on one corner and a faint edge of gold lettering along the spine that would have been perfectly legible to anyone who took more than a glance. Denise had not hidden it. She simply hadn't displayed it. There was no reason to. She was at a public recreational facility with a valid field permit, a clipboard full of lesson plans, and a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm somewhere between exit 7 and the parking lot, and she was doing her job. She uncapped the thermos and took a sip anyway. The patrol car rolled in at 8:34 a.m. and parked at the angle that blocked the exit, and Todd Brecker stepped out with the particular kind of deliberateness that some people in positions of authority develop over years of never being questioned, a heaviness to the stride, a set to the shoulders, a way of letting the boot fall hard on the pavement so the sound carries. He was 38 years old and had been with the Glenfield Township Police Department for 11 years. And in those 11 years he had developed a professional self-image that was built almost entirely on the belief that his instincts were reliably correct. He had blonde hair, cut short in a style that hadn't changed since his academy graduation photo, and a broad square jaw that had a tendency to harden visibly when he encountered something he had already decided was a problem. His face was the kind of permanently reddened that comes from years of outdoor work, and his eyes were a flat, pale blue that didn't soften much in any direction. He was not a man who thought of himself as someone who made assumptions. He thought of himself as someone who read situations accurately. Behind him, half a step back and slightly to his right, came Officer Kyle Vance. Kyle was 29 and had been on the job for just over 2 years. And his default mode in field situations was still to watch what Todd did and do the same, because 2 years was not long enough to have developed the kind of independent judgment that allows you to override a training officer, and Todd was the kind of training officer who did not invite disagreement. They walked toward the bleachers together, and Todd's hand was already resting near his duty belt before he had covered half the distance, which was a habit he probably didn't register consciously anymore, and which said something about what he had already decided this was going to be. Denise saw them coming when they were still 20 yards away. She stood up slowly from the bleacher, setting her clipboard aside, and held both hands slightly away from her body and at a visible height, not raised exactly the way you raise them when someone points something at you, but positioned clearly, deliberately, so that the first thing visible to anyone approaching was that her hands were open and empty. This was not a response born of fear. It was a response born of training, specifically the kind of training that teaches you to reduce variables in situations where variables can go wrong quickly, and Denise had given that training to other people often enough that the posture had become entirely automatic. Todd didn't slow down when she stood. He didn't shift the angle of his approach or alter his expression in any way that suggested the open hands had registered as the de-escalatory gesture they were intended to be. He spoke before he reached the bottom of the bleacher section. The words were the same ones he had said getting out of the car about this being a family area, about her kind not belonging here, but up close. They had a different quality, more intimate and more contemptuous. The way a thing said quietly can sometimes be worse than the same thing shouted, because it implies the speaker doesn't think you're worth the volume. Denise looked at him for a moment without responding. Then she said calmly and without inflection that she was there to prepare for a youth training clinic scheduled for the following morning, and that she had a field permit issued by the township's recreation department, and that it was in the front section of her clipboard, which she gestured toward, without picking it up. Todd's hand moved in a small dismissive wave, the kind of wave that means I heard what you said, and I'm choosing not to engage with it, and he told her he'd need to see her ID. She retrieved her wallet carefully, both hands visible throughout, and as she drew out her driver's license, the small black case in the side pocket of her bag shifted slightly, and the edge of the raised seal caught the early morning light. The gold lettering on the spine would have read clearly to anyone who looked directly at it. Todd looked at it for approximately 1 second, then looked back at her face. Kyle Vance, standing slightly behind and to Todd's right, looked at the case for a moment longer. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at Todd's back. He didn't say anything. Todd took the license and glanced at the address, which showed Detroit, and said something about her being 40 minutes from home and wanting to know what she was really doing here. The word really carrying an implication that the explanation she had already given didn't count. Denise said she worked throughout the state, that her permit specified the facility and the dates, and didn't require a narrative, and that she was happy to answer questions, but that the permit and her credentials would confirm everything she was telling him. Todd turned to Kyle and said something about checking the bag. Kyle stepped forward and began lifting items from the outer pocket of the duffel, the thermos, a small first aid kit, a folded rain jacket. Then he reached the main compartment and pulled out the training manuals, 3 of them, their covers showing frameworks and terminology that looked institutional. Official federal in a way that wasn't dramatic, but was unmistakable if you were paying attention. He set them on the bleacher bench. Then his hand closed around the small black case. He held it for a moment. He looked at the seal. He looked at the lettering along the spine. Todd said without looking, "Just leave it." Kyle set the case back down. The sound it made on the aluminum bench was small, a quiet click, like the mechanism of something engaging, and nobody remarked on it, and the moment passed and it would come back to Kyle later in a way he wasn't prepared for. Todd called in on his radio. His voice was the same flat, professional tone he always used, even-keeled official, the voice of someone documenting a situation rather than creating one. He reported a suspicious person, non-compliant. Denise looked at the angle of the body camera on his chest. It was pointed slightly downward toward the pavement, capturing neither his face nor hers with any clarity. She noted this, the way she noted everything, precisely without comment, filing it away in the column of things that would matter later. Sergeant Wayne Holt arrived 11 minutes after Todd's radio call, which was 3 minutes faster than the standard response time for a non-emergency call to this sector of the township, and the speed of his arrival suggested he had either been nearby already or had decided based on whatever Todd told him that this situation warranted urgency. He was 54 years old, with silver hair cut close to the skull in a style that matched the general austerity of his bearing, and he walked with the settled confidence of a man who had spent 26 years in a system that had never once seriously questioned his judgment. He was not a cruel man, not in the way that people who enjoy cruelty are cruel. He didn't take pleasure in dominance for its own sake, the way Todd sometimes seemed to. His cruelty, if you could call it that, was more bureaucratic than personal, the cruelty of a man who had decided a long time ago who the problems were, and who the taxpayers were, and who required protection, and who required management, and who had never been required to examine or revise those categories in any significant way. He stepped out of his car and walked toward the bleachers without looking at Denise directly. He looked at Todd and said, "What have we got?" which was how he always opened these conversations, because asking Todd what they had meant, that Todd's framing of the situation became the operational reality before anyone else's account could complicate it. Todd summarized in less than 30 seconds. Suspicious person unresponsive to requests to leave, claiming to have a permit, refusing to provide adequate documentation. The word refusing was interesting, Denise thought, given that she had offered the permit 3 separate times, and each time been waved off. She said nothing. Holt turned and looked at her for the first time. His eyes moved from her face to the clipboard on the bench, to the bag, to the scatter of training manuals Kyle had set down, and then back to her face. "You got ID," he said. "I provided my driver's license to Officer Brecker," Denise said. "I also have a field permit for this facility and professional credentials, I've offered all of them multiple times. Holt's jaw shifted slightly, the way a jaw shifts when someone is arranging what they want to say next. He said I'll need to see the credentials, and the way he said it not as an inquiry, but as an order issued to someone who had been causing problems, indicated that he wasn't actually opening a new avenue of dialogue. He was performing the appearance of due diligence, while simultaneously signaling to Todd that the process was going to continue regardless of what the credentials showed. Denise reached slowly for the side pocket of her bag. Kyle Vance was close enough to see her hand move toward the black case. He watched. His weight shifted fractionally to 1 foot. Holt said, "Todd, let's get her bag properly inventoried. I want everything on the table." Todd moved toward the bag with a purposefulness that had nothing to do with investigation and everything to do with assertion, the physical language of someone who has decided that the way to handle uncertainty is through action rather than attention. He pulled the bag open wider and began removing items with unnecessary force, setting them down hard on the bleacher bench in a way that sent the water bottle rolling and scattered the first aid kit. The training manuals he flipped open, glanced at 2 pages each, and dropped closed. He held up the small black case for a moment, turned it over in his hand. Kyle said quietly, "Todd, I've seen fake federal stuff online." Todd set the case down without opening it. "People print whatever they want." Kyle closed his mouth again. Holt looked at the case on the bench. For one moment, just one something moved across his expression that wasn't entirely certainty, a flicker of something that might have been hesitation if it had lasted long enough to name itself. Then it was gone, replaced by the smooth, institutional blankness of a sergeant proceeding according to his own definition of the situation. "Ma'am, Holt said I'm going to ask you one more time to explain your business here." Denise looked at him steadily. "I have explained my business clearly and multiple times. I have offered documentation 3 times. The documentation has not been examined. What I'd ask is that someone examine what I'm offering before this goes any further." Holt looked at Todd. Something passed between them that wasn't words, the kind of understanding that develops between people who have worked together long enough to communicate in shorthand, and whose shorthand in this case said, "We've come this far. She's not backing down, so we go forward." Holt said, "Then we'll finish this downtown." Denise said nothing. She watched Todd reach for his cuffs. The sound of the cuffs closing was small and precise, a metallic double click that carried in the morning quiet, the way small sounds do when everything else has gone still, and the metal was cold, in the way that metal at 6-degree temperatures is always cold, and Todd had positioned them slightly tighter than necessary, which was, if you were going to be accurate about it, not accidental. Denise kept her arms in the position they needed to be in and said clearly and without emphasis, "I'm not resisting. I'm complying," and the reason she said it out loud instead of simply complying silently was that it needed to be on record because she had been in enough situations over enough years to know that what gets said in the moment is the thing that exists later. Across the parking lot near the gate to the adjacent diamond, Gloria Watkins had arrived at 8:41 a.m. She was 68 years old with silver-streaked hair and the practical winter coat of someone who planned to sit outdoors for a long time, and she had come early to claim good seats in the shade for her grandson's 10 o'clock practice, which was the kind of ordinary Saturday morning errand that shouldn't require a second thought. She had stopped walking when she reached the gate and seen what was happening at the third base bleachers. She stood there for a moment, 4 seconds 5, and her face worked through something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite recognition, but was the combination of the two, the look of someone registering not just what they're seeing, but what they're seeing again, the look of someone who knows this particular shape, even though they've never been in this particular parking lot before. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her phone. Todd saw her. He was in the middle of guiding Denise toward the patrol car, one hand on her arm with more grip than the situation required, and he turned his head and spotted the phone and the angle at which Gloria was holding it, and said loudly, "Ma'am, you need to put that away. This is official police business and you're interfering." Gloria didn't lower the phone. Her voice when she spoke was even and deliberate, the voice of a woman who had grown up in a time when you didn't make certain statements without being absolutely certain you meant them, and who had decided that this was the moment for one. "I'm on public property," she said. "I'm documenting what I see." Todd took a step toward her. Kyle Vance moved slightly, and something in his movement, a fractional sideways shift, barely perceptible, the instinctive repositioning of a body that hasn't yet made a conscious decision, placed him between Todd's trajectory and Gloria, without anyone, including Kyle, quite registering that it had happened. Todd stopped. His eyes moved from Gloria to Kyle to Gloria again. He said something under his breath and turned back to Denise. Denise, in the moment before the door of the patrol car closed behind her, turned her face toward the small group of parents and the groundskeeper and Gloria Watkins with her phone and the two mothers from the minivan, who had stopped what they were doing and were standing very still, and she said her name clearly and without theater. "My name is Denise Carver. Remember that name?" The door closed. On the bleacher bench in the scatter of items Todd had emptied from her bag, the black case sat against the aluminum next to the training manuals. The field permit was on the clipboard right where she had left it visible to anyone who looked, which in the next several minutes nobody did. Todd drove with the radio on local news, and he didn't speak to Denise, and she didn't speak to him. And the silence between them had entirely different textures depending on which side of the metal divider you were experiencing it from. From Todd's side, the silence was the comfortable silence of a completed task. He had responded to a call. He had encountered an uncooperative individual. He had processed the individual according to procedure. He would file the report, fill out the form, and by noon, this would be a closed loop in a day full of them. From Denise's side, the silence was something she had been preparing for since she was old enough to understand that certain situations required a particular kind of internal discipline. The discipline of not spending energy on what you felt when what you felt couldn't be afforded right now. She had felt things in the moment when the cuffs closed that she would spend time with later in a different context. Right now, what she needed was precision. She ran through what she had. Her body camera, which had been active since 6:10 a.m., was still active. The footage was uploading automatically to a secure server every 15 minutes, which meant that regardless of what happened to the device itself, the record existed somewhere else already. She had the permit, which she hadn't been allowed to use, but which remained on the clipboard where she'd left it, presumably still at the field unless someone had moved it. She had the timestamps of every refusal and every offer she had made because she had noted them in real time in the margins of her lesson plan with the black pen which was in her bag which Todd had. She had her memory, which was the kind of memory that had been trained over years to retain detail under pressure and which was currently cataloging badge numbers and precise wording and the exact angle of a body camera on a particular officer's chest. She had also made one phone call. That was already done. She thought about the 34 kids on the roster. She thought about what she was going to say to them tomorrow when they arrived at the field for a clinic, about how to think clearly under pressure, about how to pause before acting, about how to ask the right question instead of the easy one. She thought about whether what was happening right now was something she would tell them about, and how she would tell it, and what she would want them to understand from it. She decided she would tell it exactly as it happened and let them draw their own understanding. That was what she believed in, not conclusions handed down, but thinking arrived at, and the difference between those two things was the whole reason she did this work. The Glenfield Township Police Department headquarters was a single-story brick building on Reston Avenue with a flagpole out front and a parking area in the back, designated for processing vehicles. It smelled inside of old coffee and the industrial cleaner that never quite covers what it's supposed to cover, and the fluorescent lights in the processing area had the particular hum of lights that needed replacement 6 months ago, but nobody had put in the order yet. Sergeant Donna Park handled the intake. She was 45 years old, brown hair pulled back with the permanently tired expression of someone who had been working rotating shifts for long enough that her face had stopped fully resetting between them. She asked the standard questions. Name, address, date of birth, and Todd filled out the form at the adjacent desk while she asked them, his pen moving across the carbon paper at the pace of someone who already knows what he's writing. Denise watched what Todd wrote. The form described her as having refused to provide identification and become argumentative during initial contact. She read this twice to be certain she had read it correctly. She noted the wording. She noted the time on the clock above the desk, 9:52 a.m., and she noted it in the same way she had been noting everything since 8:34, the way you note things when you know that the accounting will come eventually and you need the record to be exact. Kyle Vance came into the processing room once about 20 minutes after they arrived. He stood near the door and looked at the form Todd was filling out, and then at Denise, and then at the form again. His face was doing something complicated. Denise met his eyes once briefly, and Kyle looked away first, not defensively, more like someone who can't quite hold the weight of what they're seeing. He left without saying anything. Denise was permitted to make a phone call at 10:34 a.m. She dialed a number she had memorized, not because she had anticipated needing it in this specific way, but because it was the kind of number it made sense to have memorized in the work she did. The call lasted 41 seconds. She gave an address, 2 names, 2 badge numbers, and a time. The voice on the other end said 5 words. She confirmed with 3 words. She hung up. Donna Park, who had been close enough to hear the exchange, looked up from her paperwork and then back down again without comment. After the phone call, Denise sat back in the plastic chair against the wall, reached into the front pocket of her jeans, which Todd had not thought to search, and removed a small folded piece of paper and the stub of a pencil she kept there out of habit, and she began to write in small, precise letters, a line at a time, everything she needed the record to contain. Holt passed the doorway at 11:07 a.m. and looked in and saw Denise writing and asked Todd what she was doing. Todd said, "Taking notes or something. Ignore it." Holt looked at her for a moment, then moved on. In the desk at the far end of the room, Todd's coffee sat cooling in a styrofoam cup, and he was scrolling through something on his phone with the casual ease of a man who had finished his work for the morning and was waiting for the day to catch up with him. Gloria sat in her car for 9 minutes after the patrol car left, which was 6 minutes longer than she meant to, and 3 minutes shorter than she probably needed. She had watched the whole thing, the approach the hands-open stance from the woman on the bleachers, the repeated gesture toward the clipboard. The way the younger officer had picked up the black case and then set it back down when the older one said something. The cuffs going on the ride to the patrol car, the door closing. She had filmed from the moment the older officer put his hand on the woman's arm, and her hands had been steady enough that the footage was clear. Now she sat with the phone in her lap, watching the clip on the small screen, and she was having the internal conversation that most people have when they realize they're holding something that might matter. The conversation between the part of you that wants to do the right thing and the part of you that is 68 years old and has lived long enough to know that doing the right thing is not always without consequence. She thought about deleting it. That thought lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then she thought about the woman's face when the door of the patrol car closed. Not angry, not afraid, just present in a way that Gloria found harder to forget than either anger or fear would have been the face of someone who had been through this accounting before and was simply doing the work of going through it again. Gloria called her daughter. Her daughter said Mom post it. The Glenfield Township Community Board on Facebook had 400 members, most of them parents, grandparents, and long-term residents of the township and the surrounding areas. And most of them had joined the group to see information about road closures and school events and the occasional lost dog. Gloria's post went up at 9:23 a.m. with a caption that she had written and deleted twice before settling on something plain. This happened at Lincoln Grove this morning around 8:40. Woman was on the bleachers with paperwork and they didn't look at the paperwork. This isn't right, isn't. Within 45 minutes, 600 reactions. 182 comments. The comments were not all in agreement. They were never all in agreement in Gloria's experience, which was one of the things that made the internet both honest and exhausting at the same time. Some people said it was obviously wrong. Some people said there must have been a reason. Some people said she was already argumentative before the video started somehow without evidence. Some people said the officers were doing their job. Some people said that if you didn't want to be questioned, you shouldn't be somewhere unfamiliar and alone. But in the middle of the thread at comment 47, a man named Robert Elias wrote, "Hold on. I know this woman. She came to Pinewood Elementary last spring for a program about critical thinking and leadership. My son was in the session. It was an FBI community outreach program. She works for the FBI." The thread accelerated. Someone replied asking if he was sure. He said yes, and then he posted a photo that he found by scrolling back through his camera roll, a clear image of the woman from the bleachers standing in front of a banner that read, "Youth Leadership and Critical Thinking Community Outreach Division," with 2 other people in professional attire. The banner didn't have the letters FBI on it, but the official look of it was unmistakable once you were looking. The comment section turned sharply. The share count on Gloria's post went from 40 to 340 in the span of 2 hours, which was the kind of number that meant the post had moved beyond the Township Community Board and into the general circulation of people who were looking for exactly this kind of story, to confirm something they already believed or to push back against something they couldn't stop thinking about. At 11:24 a.m., the local news station WGLN picked it up with a tweet. Video circulating black woman detained at Glenfield Township baseball field. Officers reportedly refused to examine her credentials. Story developing. The station's social media manager tagged the Glenfield Township Police Department. The department's Twitter account had not posted anything since a Tuesday reminder about parking restrictions during a street repair project on Monroe Avenue. Parents who had registered children for Sunday's clinic began calling one another. Several of them had already seen the video. One of them, a father named Marcus Davis, had met Denise at a community forum in Lansing 2 years earlier and had personally recommended the clinic to 4 other families at his church. He posted in a separate parent group, "This is Denise Carver. I know her professionally. Whatever they think they were doing, they got this very badly wrong." The phone at the Glenfield Township Police Department front desk started ringing with a different frequency than normal. Not the steady occasional ring of people reporting minor things, but the compressed, insistent ring of people who had seen something and wanted someone to account for it. Kyle Vance was at his desk in the bullpen area when his personal phone buzzed with a notification his wife had sent him the link to the original post with no message other than 3 question marks. He opened the post. He read Robert Elias's comment. He looked at the photo. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he stood up, crossed the bullpen, and stood in the doorway of the processing room. Denise was still in the chair against the wall, still writing in her small, precise hand. The black case was visible on the evidence table where Todd had left it, still closed, still with the seal facing up. Kyle looked at the case for a long time. He didn't go in. But he didn't go back to his desk either. He stood in the doorway for a moment that was longer than a doorway moment usually is, and then he walked to the break room and poured himself a cup of coffee. He didn't drink. At 1:15 p.m., the front desk phone transferred a call to Sergeant Donna Park that was not routine. The caller identified himself as coming from the FBI's Detroit field office and stated with a brevity that carried more weight than a longer statement would have that they needed to confirm the current status and condition of Agent Denise Carver. Donna Park wrote the message on a notepad in capital letters. She read it twice. Then she walked to Chief Patricia Dunmore's office and knocked twice and opened the door without waiting for a response, which was something she had done exactly once in 7 years with this department, and which communicated to Dunmore before Donna even held up the note that this was not the kind of situation that could be processed in the normal sequence. Dunmore read the note. She set it on her desk very carefully, the way you set something down when you need a moment that looks like composure. She was 57 years old and had been a police officer for 30 years, and she had spent most of those 30 years believing that her instincts about people were sound. She was now sitting with the specific discomfort of a person whose instincts about a situation had not been her own. She hadn't been at the field, hadn't seen the encounter, had trusted the framing she received from Holt, who had trusted the framing he received from Todd, and who was now watching the consequences of that chain of delegation arrive at her desk in the form of a small yellow notepad sheet. She told Donna to send Todd to her office. Todd came in, straightening his collar, which was a thing he did when he expected recognition, the preemptive tidying of someone ready to receive a compliment. He sat down across from her, and Dunmore turned the notepad to face him without speaking. He read it. The shift in his face was not dramatic. He was not someone whose emotions moved across his face in large, visible waves. It was more like the way water level changes in a glass when the table shifts slightly. The surface was the same, but everything underneath had redistributed. Dunmore looked at him across the desk and asked one question. "Did you look at her credentials?" Todd's mouth opened. Then it closed. Outside the door in the narrow hallway that connected Dunmore's office to the main bullpen, Denise Carver sat in the plastic chair she had been moved to 40 minutes earlier, still upright, still writing the stub of pencil, moving at the same steady pace it had maintained since the station, unhurried and precise as a clock that doesn't need winding. Sunday morning arrived with 4 black SUVs in the visitor spaces of the Glenfield Township Police Department parking lot, their federal plates catching the early light in a way that was neither threatening nor subtle, simply present the way facts are present when they are ready to be acknowledged. Todd pulled into the lot at 5:53 a.m. and sat in his car for a moment longer than he needed to before getting out. The building had a different energy when he walked in through the employee entrance, and the difference wasn't in anything he could have pointed to. Specifically, the coffee machine was running, the duty roster was on the board, the same officers were at the same desks, but it was real and it was pervasive. The particular stillness of a place that knows something is happening and is holding itself carefully in the interval before it becomes undeniable. He went to his locker on instinct the way you go to familiar things when you need a moment of normalcy, and he stopped with his hand on the handle. A federal evidence seal covered the lock. Bright yellow tape, black lettering. "Do not tamper. Federal investigation." He checked the locker on each side, both untouched. Officer Brecker. He turned. A man he hadn't seen before was standing at the end of the hallway. Mid-50s, silver-streaked hair, a quiet dark suit with a federal credentials holder clipped to his belt, and the kind of face that had decided a long time ago not to broadcast its processes. James Whitfield, Assistant Director, FBI, Detroit Field Office. Whitfield said that Chief Dunmore was waiting in Conference Room A and that Todd should come now. The walk down the main corridor to Conference Room A was one of the longer walks Todd Brecker had ever taken in a building he had worked in for 11 years. Not because of the distance, which was approximately 40 feet, but because of what the walk was made of, the careful avoidance of eye contact from colleagues he had eaten lunch with for over a decade. The slight adjustments of posture as he passed, that communicated awareness of something without anyone having to say what it was. The particular silence of a shared space in which something has changed, and the change has not yet been named out loud. He pushed open the door to Conference Room A. He counted 11 people around the table, and then he saw the 12th. Denise Carver was seated near the center of the table. She was no longer wearing the navy polo and jeans from Saturday morning. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, and her FBI credentials were displayed openly on her belt. The same black case with the raised seal and the gold lettering that had been sitting on the evidence table at the station open, now facing outward, fully legible. She was sitting with both hands on the table in front of her, still, and her expression was the same expression she had worn throughout the entire encounter at the field and at the station. Not angry, not triumphant, simply and completely present. Todd sat down. He folded his trembling hands in his lap where no one could see them. Whitfield opened without preamble. He said that Todd had presumably seen the case materials provided to his union representative the previous evening, but that they were going to review the key elements in the room together so that the record was clear and the sequence was established. He turned to the laptop. The screen on the wall showed a timestamp, 6:10 a.m. Saturday. The footage was high definition and clean. The way footage from a professional-grade body camera is clean. not the grainy, compressed video of a bystander's phone, but sharp and stabilized and continuous with embedded audio that picked up ambient sound along with every exchange. Denise walking the perimeter of the field. Denise at the bleachers with the clipboard. The silver SUV arriving and the woman making the phone call. The groundskeeper going back to his work. Then Todd's patrol car rolling into the lot, parking at the angle that blocked the exit. The audio from the moment Todd stepped out of the vehicle was clear enough that no one in the room could have any uncertainty about what was said or the register in which it was said. We don't need your kind loitering around here where families are trying to enjoy themselves. Nobody in the room moved. Whitfield paused the footage. He asked Todd if he recognized the voice. Todd said nothing. Whitfield said, "That was your voice." "Officer Brecker, in your own words, before you had conducted any investigation, before you had spoken to the caller, before you had asked a single question of the individual at the field, you communicated that she was a problem and that she didn't belong there. That was your opening statement." He advanced the footage. Every moment of the encounter at the field played back in sequence, Denise's open hands, the 3 separate offers of the permit. The dismissive wave, Kyle's hesitation at the black case, the cuffs closing, the unnecessary pressure on the arm during the walk to the patrol car. Denise saying her name clearly as the door closed. Then the screen changed. 5 years of stop data from Todd's own departmental records. The numbers were not complicated. 234 stops. 201 of those stops involved people of color, representing 86% of his activity in a township where people of color represented 24% of the population. 14 civil complaints in his file. 0 sustained. The township had paid $287,000 settling lawsuits in cases where Todd was the primary officer. Then a photograph pulled from a public social media archive dated 3 years earlier. Todd at a community event standing beside 2 men who held signs with language that no one in the room needed Whitfield to explain. Todd's expression in the photograph was relaxed and easy. He was smiling. Frank Olson, the union representative, shifted in his chair. Chief Dunmore was looking at the table surface in front of her. Whitfield moved to the next image, the field permit that had been sitting on the clipboard at the bleachers the entire time. Valid. Issued by Glenfield Township's own recreation department. Stamped and signed. Covering the facility and the date range in question with Denise Carver's name on it. Then Whitfield picked up the black case from the evidence bag on the table beside him. He opened it. He turned it so the room could see. He read the full contents aloud. Not just the name and the badge number, but the title, which was Lead Instructor FBI Implicit Bias and De-Escalation Training Program, Midwest Region, and which was followed by 8 years of service notation and the names of the 47 police departments in 6 states where Denise had conducted training, and which included the names of 2 U.S. congressional subcommittees before which she had testified, and which concluded with the reason she was in Glenfield Township at all, a formal training request filed by this department 8 months ago following a DOJ inquiry that had identified concerning patterns in the department's use of force and stop activity against residents of color. The room was very quiet. Whitfield set the case down. The training that Detective Carver came here to deliver, he said, was scheduled to begin tomorrow morning, in this building, for this department. For every officer in this room, including Officer Brecker. Todd was looking at the center of the table. Denise spoke for the first time. Her voice was not raised and it was not soft. It was the voice of someone who had been doing this work for long enough that the voice itself had become a precision instrument, clear, measured, and carrying the particular authority of someone who has nothing left to perform, because they have already been through every step of the worst of it. She asked Todd one question. She asked how many people in the 5 years reflected in the data on that screen had not had the permit and the camera and the 41-second phone call and the credentials in the case that he had chosen not to open. How many of them had had nothing but the truth and no one to confirm it, and had gone through what she went through on Saturday and walked away from it with no record, no consequence for anyone but themselves. and how many of them had filed complaints with this department that had been resolved internally in Todd's favor 0 times, sustained in a file that was now projected on a wall in a room full of people who could see exactly what that pattern had looked like for 11 years. She didn't need him to answer. The screen behind her was answering for her steadily and without mercy. Frank Olson cleared his throat and said that Officer Brecker had responded to a 911 call in good faith and that the subsequent actions were consistent with departmental protocol for suspicious person complaints, and that the union would be prepared to argue that position in any venue. Whitfield said, "Let's hear the 911 call." The audio was 14 seconds long. A woman's voice, anonymous, saying there was a black woman at the baseball field and she seemed suspicious. No description of behavior. No allegation of any specific conduct. The call ended there. Olson said nothing further. Kyle Vance had been sitting at the far end of the table, slightly apart from the rest of the department personnel since the meeting began. He had said nothing and had been watching the presentation with the focused, uncomfortable attention of someone who already knows everything being shown but is experiencing the difference between knowing it and watching it reflected back at full scale with federal documentation attached. He stood up. Olson looked at him sharply. Kyle didn't look at Olson. He spoke slowly and in sequence because he had been organizing this in his mind since Saturday afternoon, and he wanted it to be accurate, not effective. He wanted it to be the thing that happened, not the thing that made him sound a certain way. He said that Denise had been cooperative from the moment of first contact. He said she had offered the permit 3 times, once verbally and twice by gesture toward the clipboard, and that Todd had declined to examine it each time. He said that he had personally held the black case in his hand at the field, and had seen the seal on it and started to say something, and Todd had told him to leave it, and that he had left it, and that this was a decision he had been sitting with since Saturday morning. He said that the description of Denise as argumentative on Todd's report was inaccurate, and that he knew it was inaccurate when he read the form at the station and had said nothing then either, and that he was saying it now under oath and on the record, because the only thing he could do with having not said it then was to say it clearly and completely now. He sat back down. The room was quiet. Todd's jaw was tight in a way that had moved past anger into something closer to the disorientation of a person who has been relying on a version of reality that the room is no longer supporting. He said, "I was protecting the community. I was doing my job." Denise looked at him. She didn't look away, and she didn't rush what she was going to say next, which was this, that his job had been to serve everyone in that community, not to decide in the parking lot before he had asked a single question who was allowed to be there and who needed to explain themselves, and that the data behind her on the screen represented 11 years of those decisions made the same way with the same outcome toward the same group of people, and that the difference between what happened to her on Saturday and what had been happening to people in this community for more than a decade was that she had a camera and a credential and a phone number and 47 years of experience navigating exactly this situation, and that most of the people in his stop data had had none of those things, and that was the real accounting that needed to happen in this room. Dunmore called a 15-minute break. In the hallway, Frank Olson moved toward Todd with the expression of a man who has done the math and doesn't like the answer. He said without preamble and without the softening that union representatives typically employed in these conversations, that the evidence was what it was and the documentation was what it was, and that the union would advocate for Todd's procedural rights through any formal process, but was not in a position to contest the evidentiary record in the room they had just come from. Todd said I was following protocol. Olson said the camera was off for 53 minutes, Todd. Start there. He walked back toward the conference room. Todd stood alone at the end of the corridor in the building he had come to work in every morning for 11 years and looked at nothing in particular. Patricia Dunmore stood at the window of the small anteroom off the hallway and looked at the parking lot with the 4 federal SUVs in it, and she thought about 30 years of mornings and what she had spent them doing, and she thought about the notepad sheet from yesterday afternoon, and the question she had asked Todd, and the way his mouth had opened and closed without producing anything that could be called an answer. And she thought about the photo on the screen of the man smiling beside the signs 3 years ago, and the 0 sustained complaints in a file that now had $287,000 attached to it in settled litigation, and she thought about the fact that she had read those numbers in departmental reports more than once and had processed them in exactly the way the department had always processed them, which was as background noise as cost of operations. As something other than what the screen in that room had just made completely and unavoidably clear they were. She found Kyle Vance near the break room doorway. She looked at him for a moment, and then she nodded, not in approval exactly, but in the way you acknowledge a person who has done a difficult thing and done it right. When everyone returned to the table, Dunmore spoke before Whitfield could resume. She said, "We'll accept the consent decree." She said it plainly, without qualifications, without the lawyered phrasing of institutional self-protection, without the preemptive defenses that the city attorney had been preparing since Saturday afternoon. She said it as a statement of the only thing that could honestly be said. Whitfield acknowledged this and turned to the terms. The consent decree required 5 years of federal court monitoring, a complete rewrite of stop documentation policy, automatic body camera activation with independent cloud storage that no one in the department could access or delete, a community accountability board with subpoena power staffed by residents who reflected the actual demographics of the township, an early intervention system that would flag patterns in officer behavior before they compounded over 11 years into something that required a federal meeting to address, and the department's formal acceptance of the FBI training program that Denise Carver had come to deliver. Todd heard the list of terms from the far end of the table where he was sitting, and he heard his own name in it and the specific consequences attached to his name, and they were what they were, and he was not going to perform surprise about any of it. Denise sat across from him and listened to the terms without expression, because the terms were not the point, and she had never thought they were. The terms were what happened after the point. The point was what had been on the screen. The termination notice arrived at Todd Brecker's home address via certified mail on a Tuesday morning in an envelope from the Glenfield Township Human Resources Office, and the document inside was 2 pages long and cited 4 specific policy violations: failure to verify offered credentials, falsification of a field report, deactivation of body camera during an official duty encounter and conduct unbecoming an officer, and concluded with the determination that his employment was ended effective immediately. The Michigan Law Enforcement Officers Training Council processed the revocation of his certification within 72 hours of receiving the department's documentation, which was faster than the standard timeline, and which meant that by the end of that week his name had been added to the National Decertification Index, the national database that prevents officers who have been removed for cause from simply moving to another state and re-entering law enforcement under a new department's jurisdiction. He could not be hired as a police officer anywhere in the country. Wayne Holt received a demotion to patrol officer and reassignment to a desk post while he completed a mandatory 120 hours of retraining that the consent decree specified for supervisory-level personnel who had been directly involved in the incident. He accepted both without filing a formal challenge, which his union representative said later was the only sensible decision available given the circumstances. Kyle Vance received a commendation, an actual formal document placed in his permanent file for what the notation described as truthful cooperation during federal review and demonstration of professional integrity under significant peer pressure. Chief Dunmore presented it to him personally in a brief meeting in her office, and she said something that she had not scripted and that he would remember for the rest of his time in law enforcement, that the hardest part of this job was not the dangerous situations, but the quiet ones, the hallway moments, the doorway moments when you could see something and nobody was asking you to say what you saw, and that what you did in those moments was the actual definition of the job, regardless of what the manual said. Gloria Watkins received a formal letter of acknowledgement from Whitfield's office, which she read at her kitchen table on a Thursday evening, and then folded neatly and placed in the drawer where she kept things she considered important enough to keep her marriage certificate, her late husband's military discharge papers, her grandchildren's birth announcements. It went in that drawer without ceremony, because Gloria was not a person who required ceremony to know when something mattered. The consent decree reforms were implemented on a 90-day rollout. The new documentation system required detailed notation for every stop, the specific articulated reason, the duration, the outcome, the demographic information, and supervisors reviewed reports within 24 hours. The automatic body camera protocol activated when officers exited their vehicles and uploaded footage to an independent cloud server every 8 minutes. Nobody in the department could edit, delete, or access those files. The Community Accountability Board was seated within 60 days, its 11 members drawn from across the township's actual population with real subpoena power and a published obligation to respond to every complaint they received. And Denise Carver's clinic was rescheduled and held the following Sunday in the main assembly room of the Glenfield Township Police Department with every officer on the roster attending. The assembly room had 47 chairs arranged in a semicircle when Denise walked in on Sunday morning, and every chair was occupied, and the room had the specific particular atmosphere of a space full of people who have been required to be somewhere they are uncertain about, which is both the hardest kind of room to work with and the most important kind to get right. She stood at the front for a moment without speaking. Not for dramatic effect, but because she needed to see the room clearly before she began the people who were paying attention, and the people who were performing inattention, and the people who were genuinely uncertain about what they were about to experience, which was its own kind of readiness if you knew how to reach it. She had been in this building 2 days ago in handcuffs. She was in it now with credentials displayed standing in front of everyone who worked there. And the distance between those two versions of the same building was the whole subject of the next 3 hours. She started not with a slide or a data point, but with a question. She asked how many people in the room had ever been stopped somewhere they had a legal right to be in a situation where they had to explain themselves to someone with authority who had already decided the explanation wasn't sufficient. The hands that went up were distributed across the room in a particular pattern. She looked at the pattern and let the room look at it with her. She asked a second question, how many people in the room had ever seen a colleague do something they knew wasn't right and said nothing about it in the moment. The room was quieter for longer with this question. Hands came up slowly. Not all of them, but more than half, and the slowness of them, the considered reluctant honesty of them was more informative than the number. Kyle Vance's hand was among them. It went up without hesitation, and it was the first one up, and several people in the room looked at him and then looked away, and the weight of what that meant settled without anyone having to name it. Denise said, "This is where we begin, not with blame, with honesty about what the job asks of us, and what it asks of the people we encounter, and whether those two things have been balanced in the way the job actually requires." She showed footage over the next 2 hours. Not the footage of her own arrest, which she had decided was not the right teaching tool for this room on this day, but footage from other departments, other situations. All of them focused on the same thing, the moment just before. The moment, the 2-second window where a decision gets made and a different decision was available, and the difference between them was not instinct, but attention. An officer in the 3rd row, white 50s with the expression of someone who had been a cop longer than some people had been alive, and who had arrived in his chair with his arms crossed and his conclusions apparently already reached, watched a particular clip from a community policing program in Columbus with an attention that shifted over approximately 90 seconds of footage from detached to something much harder to name. He didn't uncross his arms, but he didn't look away either, and he didn't look away for the rest of that segment, and Denise noticed without drawing any attention to it, because she had learned that the most significant changes in a room were the quiet ones. At the end of the session, as people were moving toward the coffee table and the handouts, a young officer Denise hadn't spoken with before 26 maybe, with the careful eagerness of someone in their first full year on the job, approached her and asked whether the curriculum materials were available to take home and review. She said yes and handed him a copy of the reading list. He said thank you and stood for a moment as if he was going to say something else, then decided against it and left. Gloria Watkins arrived at 11:15 during the final portion of the session, and sat in the two empty chairs near the back that Denise had told the organizers to leave unassigned. Nobody had invited her. She had come because she had been thinking about this all week, and because 68 years of living had taught her that there were moments that required your presence even when you hadn't been asked for it. When Denise saw her across the room, she didn't stop speaking, and she didn't smile, and she didn't acknowledge the arrival in any way that would have been visible to the rest of the room. She and Gloria looked at each other for exactly the length of a breath, the kind of recognition that doesn't require anything added to it. And then Denise continued. Todd didn't watch the news that Sunday. He was sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store in a town he had moved to 40 miles from Glenfield in the driver's seat of his truck, with the engine off, reading a text message from his wife that said she needed more time and that she would be in touch through her sister. He had a folder on the passenger seat, applications for private security positions, the kind of work that was available to people with law enforcement backgrounds and no current certification, and a record that was findable if anyone looked it up carefully enough. The top edge of the first page had been bent and re-straightened multiple times, the crumpling of something held and put down and picked up again over several days. He opened his phone and found the original post from Gloria Watkins' Facebook, which he had looked at 4 times in the past week without watching the video. He read Robert Elias's comment about recognizing Denise from the school program. He read a reply further down in the thread from someone whose kid had attended Sunday's clinic. She talked to them for 3 hours, and they were all listening the whole time. My son said it was the best thing he'd ever done. Came home and asked me questions I didn't know how to answer. Todd closed the app. He sat in the parking lot for a while longer, looking at the ordinary Sunday afternoon of a town that didn't know him, and the stack of applications on the passenger seat sat in his peripheral vision like something he would deal with eventually. The following Sunday, Lincoln Grove Baseball Complex held its clinic with 34 registered children and 19 additional walk-ins whose parents had heard about it through the community board, and Denise arrived at 6:10 a.m., the same way she always arrived, with her clipboard and her red thermos and her tactical bag, and she walked the perimeter of the field in the early quiet and made her notes, and she stood for a moment on the exact stretch of bleacher where she had been sitting when the patrol car rolled in, and she looked out at the empty field in the low morning light, the way you look at a place that has asked something difficult of you and that you have decided to stay with anyway, because the work is the work, and the field is the field, and 34 names on a roster don't care about the week before they care about the morning that's actually here. Kyle Vance came to the clinic. He didn't come in uniform, and nobody had asked him to come. He came because he had been thinking all week about the second question Denise had asked in the assembly room, and because he wanted to watch her work with the kids and understand something about the job that 11 years on the force had not fully taught him. He sat in the last row of bleachers and watched her ask a 12-year-old girl a question about fairness, and listened to the full answer before she said anything back, and he wrote something in the small notebook he carried in his jacket pocket that he almost never opened, and he wrote it slowly, as if he was trying to make sure the weight of it pressed through all the way to the next page. At the end of the afternoon, when the kids had gone home and the bleachers were empty again, Denise packed her bag and picked up the thermos, and Gloria Watkins came through the gate from the parking lot and walked toward her across the infield grass, unhurried in the way of someone with nowhere else to be. They stood together for a moment in the long, late light without speaking, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. And then Gloria turned and walked back the way she had come, and Denise slung her bag over one shoulder and looked once more at the empty field. In a file folder in the Detroit office, the request list for the next training cycle had grown to 49 departments, and Glenfield Township was the first name at the top. Not because it was the most important, but because it had asked first 8 months ago before any of this happened, which was the thing that made it matter most. If this story moved you, if you've ever been judged before anyone asked a single question, or if you've ever been Kyle Vance standing in a doorway deciding whether to speak, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like Denise's don't end in conference rooms. They end in the moments that follow, in the rooms we change because of them. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about real courage, real justice, and the quiet decisions that shape everything that comes after.